All right, this is for chapter 2, sentence patterns. Now, this one is going to require a lot of practice. So we're going to look at several examples in this video and in class, but don't worry if you don't feel like you're getting it right away. We'll keep drilling it over and over until you start to feel more comfortable. It will require that you feel confident being able to distinguish between the subject and the predicate. So if you don't feel like you've really gotten that yet, keep working on that as we go through these examples. Now, in the last chapter, the main points we wanted to grasp were the different types of words and their meaning and how we identify subjects, predicates, and prepositional phrases. In this chapter, we're going to focus more on the structure of sentences. And if you feel like you're too much in the weeds already, just remember that, okay, the overall goal here is to help us first understand how sentences are structured so that we can then ultimately understand how can they be structured in more clear and effective ways. I guess what I'm saying is, if you feel like you are just sort of lost trying to kind of find your way out, there is a goal here that we're aiming for. It's going to take us a few steps to get there though. Now, to analyze sentences, we can essentially use 7 different patterns, which are shown here. And I'm going to go through these one by one, and then we will look at several examples. Before we get to the patterns though, let's go over a few key terms. First off, complement refers to a word or phrase that is necessary to complete a part of the sentence. We'll be talking about subject and object complements, but direct and indirect objects are also complements of a type. So if ever you feel like you are missing something in a sentence so that it doesn't sound like English, what you are probably missing is a complement of some sort. So note that this is not the same thing as nonsense, which can be grammatical. We saw that with Jabberwocky. We can also see it with this sentence. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that. Let me get back to the presentation. All right, so as I was saying, the complements are necessary to make a sentence grammatical. That is not the same thing as nonsense. Nonsense can be grammatical. We saw that with the Jabberwocky poem. It still had the semblance of English. We can also see it with this sentence here. I opened several Thursdays into my front philosophy pocket, and then I fireplaced my way across justice. Now, that doesn't have any sense to it, but it's still grammatical. Compare that, though, to this other sentence, I opened. That makes a little bit more sense, but it's actually non-grammatical because we need to know what you opened. And there's this instinct in us to say, well, what is being opened, right? That suggests it's a direct, or it needs a direct object. It requires a complement. So that's the difference between sensical and nonsensical. Hold on again. Okay, so let's move on. Some other key terms. Intransitive means verbs that do not need a complement or object, and transitive means verbs that do need a complement or object. Yes, Gwen. All right. Intransitive, verbs that do not require complements. Transitive, they do require complements or objects, as we call them. Now, the predicate we saw last time is a verb phrase with all its complements. Note that this does not include optional adverbials or the subject. I do recognize that in the last lecture I said, and if that's not the subject, that's the predicate. But that was just to kind of make a general point to distinguish between the subject part and the verb part. There are adverbials that are optional, and we'll talk about those. And when we talk about the predicate, we're really just mean the verb and its complements. So I didn't want to confuse things too much, but now I want to refine that definition and say the verb and all its complements and modifiers, okay? Finally, imperative just means a command sentence. It's when you tell somebody to do something. All right, let's actually look at those patterns. Now, the first 2 types of sentence patterns use the to be verb, but they are different enough that we need to classify them differently. So the sentence pattern number 1 is when we have a subject and then the to be verb, and then some type of adverbial, like the prepositional phrase on their way, or here. They are here would be another example of this sentence pattern. Notice how this type of adverbial is a necessary complement. You could not just say they are and end your sentence. That doesn't make any sense. It's not grammatical. This adverbial completes the verb to be but it does not define the subject. Instead, it defines time or place. Okay, so it's an adverbial that references time or place without directly defining or describing the subject. That is in contrast to the second sentence pattern that does use the to be verb to define the subject. We call that the subject complement. Even though it's not really completing the to be verb, it's completing or defining the subject. Now, the subject complement can either be an adjectival or it can be a nominal, as it is in this example sentence. In this case, it is a noun phrase. The subject, the moral combat for the Sega Genesis, is being defined as the greatest video game ever, and a noun phrase. And the to be verb is connecting that subject complement with the subject. In this example, the subject complement is an adjectival. In this case, an adjective, happy. Notice again how the boy is would be non-grammatical. You as a listener or reader would say, wait, the boy is what? Finish that sentence for me. So if you have that reaction, that's a signal that there is a complement that is missing. Now, another way to think of the subject complement is that you can move it into an adjectival position, because subject complements are basically forms of adjectives. As I've done with these two examples right here. It could simply modify the subject as an adjectival, but if I want to place special emphasis on it, then I would use to be and make it the subject complement. So that's the difference between saying, this rainy day, which is, this rainy day, which is depressing, made me go upstairs and hang out in my room, okay? If I want to emphasize the depressing aspect, I would make it a subject complement. This rainy day is depressing. All right, so pattern number 3 is exactly like pattern number 2, except instead of to be, we are using what we call a linking verb, because it's linking the subject with its subject complement. These verbs are really similar to be, but they do have a slightly different meaning. But they're like to be in the sense that they require a subject complement. So seems, for instance, is a verb to say that some subject appears to be, but might not actually be some subject complement. You know, the boy seems happy is similar, but different from the boy is happy. So other linking verbs include appears, becomes, remain, sounds. These verbs require a complement, but they're the same type of complements as pattern number 2, which are complements that define the subject. You would never have a pattern 3 linking verb and a adverbial, for instance. It would only come with subject complements. So Mortal Kombat for the Sega Genesis remains the greatest video game ever. Same as the previous example with the to be verb, we just have a different type of verb, but we still have a subject complement. This rainy day became depressing. Very similar to the same structure as the last one, but a different verb, so a different pattern. Remains and became require complements, but their complements ultimately define the subject. Okay, pattern number 4. These are sentences whose verbs require no complements at all. You just have the sentence, the subject, the verb, and then any optional adverbials, but nothing else is required. So I leave, or I will leave, or I am leaving. That's all we need, and we could end the sentence there. It's the meaning is clear and grammatical. The dude abides. The dude is the subject, the verb is abides, and no complements are required to make more sense of that sentence. Pattern number 5, these are sentences that have verbs that do require complements. So these are what we call transitive verbs. And the complements that they require are called direct objects. Now, direct objects are always a noun or a noun phrase or some type of nominal that completes the transitive verb, okay? My sense is that most sentences out there are pattern 5 sentences. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think between pattern 5 and pattern 2, you have most of the sentences in English. So to see if something is optional or necessary, just try to see if you could drop it and if it would still make sense. So verbs like carries, buys, hits, you wouldn't say I carries, or excuse me, I carry. You wouldn't put a period there because you need to say, well, what are you carrying? You wouldn't say I pet. Are you petting your dog? Are you petting your face? What does that mean? I fought, totally non-grammatical. I fought what? I fought the law and the law won, right? The law won would be an intransitive verb. You don't need to say anything. You can just say, I won, the law won, and it's intransitive. It doesn't require complement. Okay, let me pause for a moment and emphasize that whether a verb is transitive or intransitive will depend on the context, because many verbs can be both. I think, in fact, win could be, I won the game. Yeah, that's a transitive verb. Or I win, it could be intransitive. So that's an example. Now here's some more. For instance, I sing can be intransitive if you mean I habitually sing, or it could be transitive if you are saying that you are singing something specific, like the body electric. I sing the body electric. I am writing is intransitive and means at this moment right now, I am putting words on a page or screen. Whereas I am writing my first novel is transitive and means I am at work writing my first novel. Some verbs require, and this is pattern number 6, require 2 complements, a direct object and an indirect object. Now, the indirect object is a nominal that is the recipient of the direct object. It's usually an actual thing or person. So verbs like gives or sends can require direct objects. The child sent Santa Claus her wish list. The child is the subject. Sent is the verb. What was sent? The wish list. Who was it sent to? Santa Claus. The child sent Santa Claus her wish list. Now, I will admit that indirect object sentences are more rare than you might expect, because normally we use a prepositional phrase rather than an indirect object, and those are not the same thing. Indirect objects are always nominal, while prepositional phrases are always adverbial or adjectival. Okay, so that's a key distinction. I kicked Sally the ball is a sentence with an indirect object. The direct object is the ball. Sally is the indirect object, the recipient of the object. Notice that indirect objects actually come before direct objects in our sentences. The girl sent Santa Claus her wish list. Santa Claus comes before wish list. The indirect object comes first. You have 2 nominals in a row, essentially. In this case, Sally and the ball. But if I were to say, I kicked the ball to Sally, then that's actually a direct object sentence, a pattern number 5, where I is the subject, kicked is the verb, the ball is the direct object, and to Sally is actually an optional adverbial because it's not necessary to be grammatically coherent. You could say, I kicked the ball, period. Now, somebody might want more information, but whether or not you give it to them is optional. You don't require that information in order for it to be grammatical. That's going to be important when we talk about optional adverbials, about the difference between useful information versus necessary complements. All right, last one. Pattern number 7 is pretty tricky, but fortunately it's not very common, so you don't have to deal with it very often. This is when you have a verb that requires a direct object, and then we actually attach an object complement to that object. Object complements are like a subject complement in that they can be adjectivals or they can be nominals, and they define that object in a way that you might say modifies them, but you could set it up to be a sort of a modifier. So you see this with verbs like elects, makes, or considers. For instance, he is a subject, makes, what does he make? He makes studying for exam. Well, what does he make studying for exams to be? He makes them fun. So he makes studying for exams fun. Of course, you don't need the to be verb to connect fun with studying for exam, because that's what makes is doing. Makes is connecting studying for exams with fun, in a sense. Here's another example. We elected her president of the student body. We is the subject. What did we do? We elected. Who did we elect? We elected her. And we could potentially end a sentence there and have it make grammatical sense. We elected her. But if we want to define what we elected her to be, then we would add an object complement. We elected her to be president of the student body, which is the complement to her. All right, so I've been talking a lot about optional adverbials. It's time that I actually dig into them a little bit more. Like I said, when you are defining the sentence pattern, you can go ahead and ignore everything that is not grammatically necessary. Use your intuition to kind of figure out what is in fact grammatically necessary. but don't confuse it with something that just seems necessary to provide information that we would expect, okay? So there are verbs, well, let me just kind of point out something real quick. Let's look at what I have on the screen. Optional adverbials can be adverbs, they can be nouns, they can be noun phrases, they can be prepositional phrases, they can be all sorts of things. So it can be tricky to figure out if they are in fact optional or necessary, but remember, try to move it around and try to see if you take it away, if it makes sense. If you can move it around, it is definitely optional, because everything that is a complement that is necessary has to follow a clear syntax, and it has to follow in an order. It can't be moved around, not in English at least, all right? Now, things are gonna get confusing because there are two other types of verbs. One we call prepositional verbs, and these are verbs that actually include a preposition as part of the verb phrase, and these are transitive verbs. So buy in or catch on. I catch on to, well, that's a bad example. Yeah, ignore catch on. I bought in, well, that would require to as well. Okay, I made these examples pretty rough and quick, so we'll just talk about prepositional verbs later. But there's also something called phrasal verbs, and phrasal verbs are verbs that require a preposition, but that preposition actually doesn't do anything, it doesn't mean anything. Verbs like drop off or pick up, okay? So I dropped off the kids, or I could say I dropped the kids off, and the fact that that preposition off can kind of move around, that indicates that's a phrasal verb. It's just not an optional adverbial. Off is part of that verb, but it's just a different type of verb. Same thing goes for pick up. Let's just kind of set this aside and focus on the simple stuff for now. Hold on a second. All right. Lastly are imperatives. Imperatives are just commands. And you might be wondering, well, what type of sentence pattern are they? Imperatives can be any type of sentence pattern. The key with imperatives is to know that with imperatives, the subject is always you or you all, and it's often going to be left implied or unsaid. So once you plug in you into the subject, then you just analyze it as normal. So hit me with your best shot becomes you hit me with your best shot. That would actually be a pattern 5 sentence, because you is the subject, hit is the verb. What are you hitting? Me, that's the direct object. And then with your best shot, it's an optional adverbial. And we know it's optional because you hit me is grammatically clear and makes sense, as opposed to you hit, which doesn't really work as an intransitive verb, okay? So imperatives, you just treat like normal sentences. You just plug in you into the subject. All right, for the rest of the video, I'm gonna just go over examples. And I'm going to adjust the homework instructions on Canvas. All I want you to do here in these different exercises is just, number 1, identify the subject and predicate. So find that division between the two, and then identify the sentence pattern. You know, is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7? And that's it. All right, so I'm gonna try out the even numbers with you so that you can do the odds on your own. Let's go ahead and dive in. Leaders and diplomats from Egypt, Israel, and the United States were at Camp David. Now, in this exercise, they went ahead and they put in italics all adverbials, optional adverbials. So that's going to help us out. So we know that this is just an optional adverbial. No, excuse me. That's not what they did. I'm having a hard time seeing the instructions because I tried to blow it up on the screen. I think these are just adverbials, and then you have to decide if they're optional or not. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so let's try this again. Leaders and diplomats from Egypt, Israel, and the United States were at Camp David. Now, if I want to figure out the subject and I'm having a hard time, one thing I could do is just try to find the verb, because we know that every predicate has to have a tensed verb. Were, I know, is the past tense of to be. So I could start here and then just go backwards and say everything that comes before this is probably the subject. And it is. Leaders and diplomats from Egypt, Israel, and the United States. That's my subject. From Egypt, Israel, and the United States, that's a prepositional phrase. That's modifying which diplomats and which leaders. So that is an adjectival prepositional phrase, which means all of this is part of the same noun phrase with the head words, leaders and diplomats, okay? at Camp David. Now, remember that to be verbs have either two types, right? It could be pattern 1, which is when you have an adverbial, or it could be pattern 2 when you have a subject complement. In this case, it is an adverbial. We know that because 1, it has a prepositional phrase, and so prepositional phrases are adverbial subject complements, but it'll also tell us where they are. It's not defining the leaders and diplomats at all. It's just indicating their location. Let's imagine a different version of the sentence that was pattern number 2. We could say, the leaders and diplomats were Egyptian, Israeli, and American. In that case, Egyptian, Israeli, and American are all adjectives. Those would be subject complements defining leaders and diplomats. But in this case, we have sentence pattern number 1, adverbials. Let's write that there. All right, number 4, the negotiations were secret. Again, we have this tense verb were. Everything that comes before it is most likely the subject, and it is. The negotiations, what were they? They were secret. Secret is an adjective. No, it's technically a noun, but it's functioning here as a subject complement. Yeah, so that would be a nominal, because you'd say a secret versus secretive, which would be the adjectival form, so or the adjective form. So this is a nominal, and that's fine. All we really need to know is what type of sentence pattern, and it's a sentence pattern too. A successful conclusion to the 1978 negotiations appeared unlikely. Where's my tense verb? It's right there. What is my subject? A successful conclusion to the 1978 negotiations, which I could replace with a pronoun. It appeared unlikely. Remember that. I know that it's not in here because that's a prepositional phrase, and this is my only noun left. So that's one way to narrow it down, but I know that the whole phrase would be this: it appeared unlikely. I couldn't say a successful it, so forth. Anyways, what did it do? It appeared unlikely. Now you might think, ly, that's an adverb, that's an adverbial, this is pattern number 1. But 2 things. 1, we learned last time that unlikely and other ly words can in fact be adjectives. They're not always adverbs. This is an adjective. 2, appeared is, that's ugly. That's a linking verb. That is not a to be verb, but it's kind of like a to be verb. It connects complements. So this means it is a subject complement. It is defining the conclusion, defining it as unlikely. That's pattern number 3. Finally, the Camp David Accords were a set of agreements between former enemies. I do have some prepositional phrases. There's one right there. My tense verb is here. Were. Everything that comes before it is my subject. That's ugly. So the Camp David Accords were, and then the subject complement is a set of agreements between former enemies. And I know that it's pattern number 2 in a subject complement because this is a noun phrase. I have a set. I have a determiner there that indicates I have a noun phrase. And it could be pattern number 1, which requires adverbials, which is like adverbs or prepositional phrases. Okay. All right, let's clear the board. Again, that's all I want you to do for these exercises, to just kind of keep drilling us on these sentences. All right, let's do the even one. Early Lincoln pennies are very valuable today. I could find that tense verb, are, right here. There's no prepositional phrases. There's no introductory phrases. And so I could also just look for the first noun phrase, early Lincoln pennies, right there. What are they? They're very valuable today. Now, which one is my subject complement, or are both of them the subject complement? Well, remember to try to move things around to decide if it's optional and if it's an optional adverbial. I could say today, early Lincoln pennies are very valuable. So that would suggest it is an optional adverbial, that today is. I could not move valuable. I could not say very valuable, early Lincoln pennies are today. That doesn't make any sense. Plus, very valuable, that is an adjectival phrase, valuable being the adjective. So we know that that is a subject complement, which would make this pattern number 2 sentence. Number 4, in 1943, zinc-coated steel replaced the copper in the production of pennies. All right, this is a prepositional phrase, so I know that's not my subject. This is the first noun that I find, and these are modifying that noun, telling me what type of steel. And my tense verb is here, so I know that steel is my subject, zinc-coated steel. Boom. Replaced is my verb, it's the tense verb. What did it replace? Well, it replaced, I couldn't just say zinc-coated steel replaced. That wouldn't make grammatical sense. So that tells me, okay, this is not an intransitive verb. It's a direct object verb. It's a transitive verb, which means that it is either pattern number 6 or perhaps pattern number 7 with a complement. What did it replace? It replaced the copper. Now I'm left with this last prepositional phrase, and I have to determine, well, is this just an optional adverbial that I could move around? Or is this an adjectival prepositional phrase that is modifying the copper? And I can't move it around. I couldn't say, in 1943, in the production of pennies, zinc-coated steel replaced the copper, because it'd be like, which copper? The copper what? That the indicates a specific type of copper, and in this case, we mean the copper in the production of pennies. So this is not an adverbial prepositional phrase, it's an adjectival one, which means it's got to stay right there. And we know that this is just a pattern number 6, direct object sentence. The copper blanks for those 12 pennies were still in the press hopper during the production of the zinc-coated coins. All right, a lot going on here. We might be a little overwhelmed. Well, let's just try to find our subject and predicate first. Now, the first verb phrase that I come across is the copper blanks, and I have this prepositional phrase after it. If there's a prepositional phrase right after a noun, it usually means it's adjectival, and it happens to be the case in this one, because for those 12 pennies indicates which blanks that we're referring to. We could not say, for those 12 pennies, comma, the copper blanks. It's not movable. So that means all this is my subject. I could also find the tense verb here, were, and know that because there's no other additional phrases or anything like that, right there is my predicate verb, were. This is my subject. Now I have to figure out, okay, is this adverbial, pattern number 1, or is this subject complement, pattern number 2? The next word I find is still. Now, still is an adverb. And I could not, though, end the sentence here. I could not say the copper blanks for those 12 pennies were still. So that indicates that this is an optional adverb. I could also move it to the front. Still, the copper blanks for those 12 pennies, and it still makes sense. Were, what do I have next? In the press hopper during the production of the zinc-coated coins. Well, in the press hopper is a prepositional phrase. And in this case, like all prepositional phrases that complements are complements to were, it's adverbial. The copper blanks for those 12 pennies is my subject, were is my verb, in the press hopper is my complement adverbial, so it's a pattern number 1. And notice how this these last 2 prepositional phrases are optional because we could move them to the front. During the production of the zinc-coated coins, comma, the copper blanks for those 12 pennies were still in the press hopper. Still has the exact same meaning, so these are just optional. I have one prepositional phrase here in during and of. I should say, though, that we're treating this like one large phrase because technically of the zinc-coated coins is modifying production. Confused yet? So even a long sentence can be a pattern number 1. It doesn't have to look really simple and easy. All right, last one. Even after 100 years, the production of the Lincoln penny continues today. I have an introductory phrase. It happens to be a prepositional phrase, so I know my subject can't be in there. The next noun phrase I have is the production of the Lincoln penny. The prepositional phrase of the Lincoln penny is modifying production. So I know that this is my subject, plus I could do the pronoun. I could say, it continues today, and continues is my tense verb. So all that is mapped out. This is my subject, this is my verb. And then the question is, Okay, what about today? Today is an optional adverbial. It's an adverb that can be moved around. Today, even after 100 years, the production of the Lincoln penny continues. And continues is an intransitive verb. It does not require a complement. We can just end the sentence right there. So that is a pattern. How does the numbering go? 4, right? Wait, I'm confused now. I said direct objects were 6. No, indirect objects are 6. My apologies. This should be 5. And this is 4. Okay. All right. Erase the board. Looking at the next examples. I told you we're just going to have to drill to get these into our heads and just practice, finding that subject and verb, or that subject and predicate. Practice figuring out which type of pattern we're looking for. And you can, of course, do the other sentences with on your own and with the answers in the back. It'll be a little bit different since I'm asking you to do something different than those sentences were, or those exercises were, but it'll be close enough. They've done us the favor of underlining the optional adverbials in these sentences, so we can just ignore those. That's helpful. Number 2, scurvy was a serious problem, which we're going to ignore for sailors. Was is my tense verb. Scurvy is my first noun. That's a good place to divide the subject from the predicate. Scurvy was a serious problem. A serious problem is a noun phrase. We know that because it has a determiner and a noun head word. That means we have a subject complement nominal, which makes this a pattern number 2 sentence. When the men consumed oranges and lemons every day, notice how this is a introductory phrase, so we know the subject is not in there. It looks a lot more, looks like it's a lot more than just some sort of optional adverbial, but it is actually an optional adverbial. It's a dependent clause. So we can just ignore all that. We're left with they recovered miraculously. They is my subject, that's my noun. Recovered is my tense verb. But what about miraculously? Is this optional or is this a complement? Well, let's just try to drop it. They recovered. That makes sense. That's grammatical. There's nothing incoherent about that. Plus, we know that the ly makes this most likely an adverb. And if we moved it around, when the men consumed oranges and lemons every day, miraculously they recovered. Or miraculously, when the men consumed oranges and lemons every day, they recovered. So that's an optional adverbial. Don't know why they didn't underline that then. Again, if I can't see the instructions. Number 6, interestingly, oh no, maybe they underlined introductory clause? No, I don't know. Interestingly, Lynn's discovery affected the English language. Okay, so this is just our optional adverbial. Where's our first noun phrase? Lynn's discovery, Lynn's being possessive, affected being our tense verb. Now, is this an transitive or intransitive? Lynn's discovery affected. Could I put a period after that? No. What did it affect? It affected the English language. That's my direct object complement, the English language. It's the noun phrase. That would make, sorry, I missed these. This would be sentence 4. This would be sentence 5 patterns. Okay, now I can erase it. Last one, actually of this set, then there's another set. Because of the Navy diet, people call British sailors limeys. All right, this is a little bit more complicated. We can drop that. We know our subject is people because that is dividing the first noun phrase from the tense verb, which is call. So that's our subject. This is our verb of our predicate, but we know the predicate has to be everything else. 2, that's not optional. So what do we have here? People call British sailors limeys. This is a little bit tricky because we have 2 nominals right in a row next to each other. So that could be indirect object, object, or it could be object, object complement. What is British doing? Well, British is modifying sailors. So we know that this is our noun phrase. And then we ask the question, is British sailors the recipients of limeys, which would be a indirect object and direct object, or is limeys a way to define what British subjects are, to kind of modified them in a way. And that's exactly the case. Call is a verb that takes not only a direct object, but it takes an object complement, in this case, limeys. It is making an equal sign between limeys and British sailors. So this is a pattern number 7 sentence. I'll go ahead and just kind of compare that to number 7 because this might be a helpful distinction, okay? So if we erase that, we know that the British is our subject, called again is our tense predicate, but now we have lemons, limes. This one is actually indirect object. The British called lemons, limes. The lemons are the recipients of the direct object, which is, is that right? Wait a minute, I jumped ahead of myself. No, this is object complement again. It's number 7. I think I looked at that too quickly and assumed something different. Yep, my bad. Sorry, ignore everything I said. That's not indirect object, that's object complement. Let me find an indirect object sentence. Yeah, here's one. Number 3, Dr. James Lind, that's my first noun. It's coming right before my tense verb, so that's my subject. Fed is my tense verb, which means I got my predicate here afterwards. 6 group of scurvy victims, 6 different remedies. Okay, I've got 2 noun phrases, right, one after the other. That means I either have indirect object and object, or I have direct object and object complement. In this case, these 6 different remedies are being fed to the 6 groups of scurvy victims. In other words, the 6 groups of scurvy victims are the recipients of the 6 different remedies. So it is indirect object. Let's see if I can make a period there. Indirect object followed by the direct object, because remember the indirect object actually precedes the direct object, and this is a pattern number 6 sentence. Okay, so sorry for that confusion. Hit the board. Last 2. After the assassination of President William McKinley, Roosevelt took office at the age of 42. I'm just erasing all that because I know that my subject cannot be in that. That has to be optional. This one wants you to show why these are punctuated incorrectly, and it's basically saying that you don't put commas in between complements and the nouns or verbs that require them. So you wouldn't put a comma between the subject, Roosevelt, and the verb, took. You never put a comma between the subject and the verb of the predicate. But I really just want to know what type of sentence is this and what's the subject and verb, or subject and predicate. Roosevelt is the subject. Took office is the predicate, the whole predicate. Took is a direct object verb. It requires a complement. In this case, office is direct object. And this prepositional phrase is optional. At the age of 42, Roosevelt took office. Or at the age of 42, after the assassination of President William McKinley, Roosevelt took office. Finally, Roosevelt told veterans in Illinois. In this case, the verb here is told. Roosevelt is the subject, and it's pointing out that you would not put a comma between a transitive verb and its direct object. Fair enough. Roosevelt told veterans in Illinois, that's a prepositional phrase that happens to be optional because I can move it. In Illinois, Roosevelt told veterans, same thing. What did he tell veterans? A man who is good enough to shed his blood for his country is good enough to be given a square deal afterwards. I did the sentence too fast because I messed it up. Did you see what I got wrong? Veterans is not the direct object. What is veterans? The indirect object. It is the recipient of the direct object, and the direct object happens to be this honkin' nominal sentence right, or clause right here, okay? So this, all this is the direct object. He is saying this to veterans. Again, one way to test indirect object to direct object, could you put the preposition to in front of the indirect object and kind of just make it a prepositional phrase, and you could. But in this case, it's Roosevelt told veterans, and what did he tell them? this whole sentence. In Illinois is just the optional adverbial. Okay, that's it. Hopefully this was helpful. We'll keep practicing that because I know that it's confusing, but let me tell you, if you practice this and get comfortable with this right away, early on, everything that follows afterwards is going to be easier. Like I said, subject verb, or excuse me, subject predicate, you've got to get those right away. Once you get that, then you can identify sentence patterns. And once you can identify sentence patterns, it's all pretty simple, more or less, from there. Okay? All right. That's everything. Thanks for participating. See you in class.